You just finished up watching episode 3 of Lovecraft Country, and you desperately need a place to talk about all of the spoilerific stuff that happens in this episode. Well, don't worry, you are in the right place. Welcome to JBuck Studios, your home for reviews, reactions, and ridiculousness. And we are breaking down this episode 3 of Lovecraft Country that just aired on HBO Max. You know, obviously, getting into my spoiler-free thoughts of the episode, but then we are jumping into the spoilers and where we think this series is really going after this specific episode. But before we get into all of that, let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought of this third episode. Did this get back on track? Did this make you even more excited for the rest of this season? And what exactly do you kind of think that ending of this episode means, and kind of where things are going to go in the next couple episodes? I want to know in the comments down below. But without further ado, let's get into the spoiler-free portion of this episode. And I think that this episode, again, if you remember from last week, I wasn't too high on episode 2. I think that this episode 3 very much brings things back on track, brings in that Lovecraft, weird monster lore that we got in the first episode, very much present in this one. This episode is essentially a haunted house episode, and that's what I really liked about this episode, because it dives into those weird creatures. It is this fun, contained story, but also I think that this is almost a character episode. This is very much Leticia or Letty's episode. It's very much looking at her as a person, kind of being this selfish child at the beginning, but then transforming within these 10 days into kind of this more mature adult character. Sure, it dives into more character development and relationship stuff between Atticus and Letty and her sister Ruby, but I think that this is very much her episode. And I have to say, just rounding this out before we get into the spoilers, this was a very strong episode. I think that this is on track again, like I said with episode 1, episode 2 not so much, but this episode 3 very much brings things more on track, and I'm excited. I'm more excited now to kind of see where the rest of this season goes. Now, getting into the spoilers of this episode, yes, from the get-go, Letty, she essentially buys a house. And you find out that her mother had left them money. Ruby didn't get the money. Leticia actually got the money and was able to buy this house. And she kind of is, that selfish child at the beginning of this episode, because she wants the house to, bring in all of her friends to have a good time, essentially start a, not frat house, but kind of a party house. But then you see as the episode goes, she kind of transforms into a more mature adult, like I mentioned, and we will get into that, don't you worry. A little bit further in this episode, it starts off with this disclaimer of saying in 1955, 3 people went missing mysteriously in Chicago, and this kind of does have a little bit of historical elements tied with it. I looked this up, and yes, in 1955 in Chicago, 3 young children went missing. They were found. It's a cold case. I don't think it was ever entirely solved. So I like how the show is kind of taking these historical elements and putting them in the show, but then doing a twist on it to kind of show, hey, this is what kind of could have happened, or what if this is what happened to those 3 missing kids. So I like how they're playing into the historical elements as well. But the way this episode, from the haunting, essentially the haunting of this episode, let's just jump into that. You find out essentially from day 2 or day 3 of Letty staying in this house, there's some sort of overarching haunting, some kind of poltergeist essentially living in this house, because the scene of her getting the covers ripped off of her with that creepy looking woman with kind of a messed up jaw next to the bed, that was honestly terrifying. That right there was really, really scary. But then the way other things, the person in the mirror before her and Atticus have their scene in the bathroom, but then the Ouija board, the bump in the basement, the elevator, the room where the 3 young white dudes go into, and that basketball player with the baby head, like, that was horrifying. This episode, I think, very much jumps into the creep factor, the haunting. This is a haunted house poltergeist, bump in the night. What kind of dark presence is in this house? And that's what I loved about this episode. of bringing in those weird creatures, essentially, and especially at the end, you know, when it's the doctor that comes back from a kind of resurrection, telling them all to get out of the house, which when Atticus is essentially possessed by this guy, and he's like, blah, 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 get out of my house, like that was actually terrifying, and the effects on it looked pretty good. But when Leticia joins hands with all of the dead members, the victims to this guy that were in the house, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself a little bit, but when she joins hands with all of these and the camera works around showing how people are missing arms, jaws, have like nails and rods through their bodies, you can see how it's very gruesome and bodily, the nature of it, but you can see what these people had to essentially suffer through, and they're finally getting their revenge on this ghost, which, rewinding it a little bit because I'm all over the place, the ghost apparently is this like twisted doctor from earlier on. He had the house, and you kind of find out that him and this police officer that arrests Letty later in the episode, they kind of had this relationship, and you see that the police officer worked on the south side a lot, and a lot of black people at that time went missing. So you can kind of connect that this police officer was working with this doctor that owned this big mansion that Leticia now owns, and was kind of kidnapping people probably and bringing them to this doctor to test on them, very much test subjects. And you can see how at the end is how they're getting all of their revenge, why they are all tore up and look disgusting, because this guy was doing horrible experiments on these characters. Reeling it back a little bit to just Leticia's kind of journey through this. It's very much her episode, and she starts off, like I said, as like a kid in the candy store. We have this house, we're gonna do this with it, we're gonna do that with it, bring all these kids in, or bring all these friends in, and have them essentially pay for the mortgage. But as the episode goes, you can see how she kind of almost ages, becomes a more mature, responsible adult almost. And that scene in the bathroom with her and Atticus, you know, they get it on, surprise, surprise, you know, there was that sexual tension here or there. The dance, are they going to dance? And that is kind of the turning moment of her changing from, or almost metaphorically, from a child to an adult, because, you know, it's her first time sexually and everything like that. And I also think that that ties in with the end, because she is able to stand up to this demon and also be more mature of making this house or this mansion into a safe haven for her people, for black people to stay and to be safe. But also in the middle of it, she shows how she is becoming more of a woman, and that the ferocity in her when she's bashing all of the cars because the white people outside, which this episode does a great job, especially called Holy Ghost, of showing the horrors in the house, but also the terrifying real-world aspects of racism outside and whatnot. But when she is breaking apart all of those cars, that was such a wonderful scene, because the music is wonderful. Her just seeing how she is fed up with these cars honking and whatnot. It was wonderful. I absolutely love that part of this episode. But I think rounding it out, getting to the end of this episode, was the fact that we find out that Letty didn't actually win the lotto, didn't win the money from her mother, or the mother didn't leave the money. We find out that Christine, or Christina, the blonde woman from episode 1, had left the money for her, or bought the house for her, because Tick, Atticus, confronts her at a real estate agent or realtor office. They have this weird kind of interaction where she's saying that everyone kind of has a spell, and her father had invulnerability, and she can do something else, because she stops Atticus from killing her. He tries to pull the gun on Christine, and that's kind of the end of it. So it's interesting to kind of see what she wants with this house, because she couldn't apparently have bought it herself. The police were always saying that there was an evil presence in the house, and Leticia is now the owner of the house. And what is kind of the connection with that? Why is Christine still have her fingers or grasping out to these characters, using them? Like, what exactly is in the house that these characters want? But also, we get an introduction, or we get a little bit of George and his wife, or George's wife in this one, where you can see that they've very much moved on, not entirely from George's death. They're still dealing with it, because she's kind of getting upset that Atticus is putting cups one way, George would put him the other way, and then also the Dracula book. So you can see that she's very much kind of trying to deal with this pain of losing her husband, But when she goes upstairs in the house, the door creaks open, something guides her to this room, and you see this golden kind of mechanical solar system of sorts. And what is that? Is that what's tying back to what Christine was telling Atticus about these missing pages of the Book of Adam to being able to transcribe and get to the Garden of Eden? Is this artifact that, from what it looks like, George's wife was either she took it or she disappeared because of it? It's something about this artifact is what's reaching out to her, and it ties with those pages that Christine brought up at the end of the episode as well. So it's interesting to see how these pages, this artifact, the maybe missing George's wife, has to tie in with everything. But the very last bit of this episode, when Letty is talking with the news reporter that comes to the house, and she asks about the 3 missing white boys or whatnot, the elevator goes from floor 2, floor 1, and that's supposed to be the end of it. But then it keeps going, and you see these kind of like lighted up glyphs, essentially, I think from episode 1 that Christine kind of used as well on the doors. This elevator goes down even further, and you can see the bodies of these 3 white dudes, who, one of them, you know, it was a really cool callback of the elevator just ripping his head off. But you can see how they're down in this like cavernous area of the house, and there's a lot of other bodies that are hidden there. We can assume that those other bodies are the black people that were experimented on. They could be other people, but the light of this tunnel leading somewhere opens up. So is this why Christine has to get into the house to go down into this cavern? What is this cavern? What kind of magic is tied with it? Because the elevator goes down and there's those lighted up glyphs, essentially. So what exactly, I don't know. I love this episode. I guess overall, I love this episode. It's getting back more on track. The only negative is kind of the picture, the part where Leticia puts all of the pictures together and the dude's head pops out. It looked a little goofy. For myself, I thought it was a little cheesy. It didn't tie in with the gruesome nature of all of the other monsters and kind of poltergeist figures in this episode. But I'm curious now. Love this episode because it asks so many questions and there's no answers. What is Christine's purpose? What is that artifact that George's wife found? Why did Leticia have to buy the house? And what is that cavern down below? I think that this is a great 3rd episode to set up the rest of this season to find out all of these answers. And are the Sons of Adam going to tie back into it? Because Christine mentioned the pages that are missing and being able to get those pages in some sort of underground booby-trapped cavern or chamber, essentially, which I'm assuming is going to be that last shot of this episode. So yeah, absolutely loved it. It brings up so many more questions, but I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this episode, your theories, maybe things that I missed and didn't talk about. Let me know in the comments down below, because I definitely want to know what Christina's purpose is and what that artifact and that cavern at the bottom. Let me know if you guys have theories, because I definitely want to know in the comments down below. Anyways though, as always, thank you so much for watching. We are doing these episode breakdowns every single week of Lovecraft Country, so be sure to stay tuned every single Sunday for these breakdown episodes. Anyways though, watch some more videos up there or right over there, you know, brand new content every single week here on the JBuck Studios channel. Follow all of my social media down there, because I have no idea what's coming the next couple weeks. Actually, Tenant review tomorrow, so stay tuned for all of that. Like this video, subscribe to the JBuck Studios channel, and until next time, we'll see you later.